No problem. Just let me know. All right. Cool. All right. Hi, guys. I'm Rocky. If you didn't catch it, whoever was supposed to be in this slot apparently broke his leg. Thank you, sir. And so Wolf asked me to move over and do this in this slot. So here we are. So a little bit of brief background about me. I've been in this industry for 23 years now. I started, it was an internship. It was really kind of cool. I was looking for a senior project to do. I went to Case Western in Cleveland, Ohio, and a professor was like, you should talk to this guy. He's got some interesting stuff going on. It ends up that that guy was a guy named Dr. Peter Tippett, and he founded the company that I then was interning for and then worked for about a year or so. Disassembling Viruses was one of the first antivirus companies called Certus International, and in 93, 94, he sold that to Symantec. And so a lot of the work that the people, that I was kind of helping out, that I think became probably Norton Antivirus. But anyway, I do business risk is really kind of my title, specializing in enterprise security architecture. I do pen testing, a little bit of red teaming here and there. Myself and that gentleman over there at the video board, we're co-organizers of BSides Cleveland. And I do other stuff like woodworking and blah, blah, blah. So let's start. Enterprise security architecture. This here, this paper by Gunnar Peterson, and if you don't know who Gunnar is, absolutely look him up. His background is fantastic. His blog is the number one raindrop. So he does a lot of InfoSec and risk work, but his background is also from I think the finance vertical, and he's just a really smart guy. This document they put together in 06, 07, I believe. So enterprise security architecture has been around quite a while, and it's really kind of part of the intro here to this to this presentation is kind of about why are we still having breaches? Enterprise security architecture has been mapped out forever, and we have a ton of regulatory compliance frameworks. And yeah, Mark is absolutely right. Stop bitching about the fact that, PCI and HIPAA is not security, all right? Well, what is security, right? Because this is that, informationisbeautiful.net. Yeah, informationisbeautiful.net, little graph here, about, that represents, the largest breaches that we've seen over the last, this is actually from 2014 to present. This actual diagram goes all the way down to like 2005, so you can actually see like TJX and all that stuff, right? So all this is happening. We have in this slide here a couple of graphs, right? The one on the left is Gartner, right? Gartner, and this is our spend in information technology in trillions of dollars, right? So we, as of 2014, we're approaching $3.7 trillion. And you can see that it's, for the most part, a pretty much of an uptick in terms of what we're spending. The one on the right here is the DBIR from Verizon. And similarly, over the same time frame, breaches are going up. So we must be doing something wrong, right? Here's the deal. This is really where I think most organizations struggle, right? They understand that protecting data is an inherent crucial function of the business, but they're doing it in either a project-by-project basis, right? So it's, we need a new firewall, or we need to refresh the VPN or two-factor authentication or whatever. Or they're looking at it from a compliance perspective. Now, that makes sense because the compliance part of this, because there's a business impact to not being compliant, and that's called a fine, okay? So yeah, it makes sense that organizations are actually going to, that they will look at and treat their security program from a compliance perspective, but, the adage is, and probably the last 20 years, people, nerds like me and everybody else, it's the line, if you're compliant, you're probably not secure, but if you're secure, you're also probably compliant to whatever framework, right? So So that's really kind of the point of an overarching enterprise security architecture, right? Enterprises are very complex. And, with complexity, you need something to kind of map everything out to make sure that everything kind of like works with each other, et cetera, and all that. And what we really want to talk about here from a complexity perspective is another complete security nerd term, right? So if something is complex, it is not secure, right? The more complex something is, the less secure it is, right? And that's typically the rule of thumb here. So architecture really is the whole, the whole kind of roadmap to essentially put together what are the goals? What are our enterprise goals, right? What is the environment that we want to build, whatever we're building, what's that environment? And what is required to actually make that successful? That's architecture. That's architecture at every level, right? From building this structure to, our enterprise networks, right? So let's really kind of now, if we look at things from that enterprise security architecture perspective, we really have a number of benefits, but really the biggest one here from my perspective is this second bullet here, right? By working off of an enterprise security architecture, our role in information security is to make sure that the business people who are making the investment decisions, they make the appropriate investment decisions without having to be the technical experts. Okay? That's our role. That really is what we have to be doing in any organization. And how we do that really is through metrics. And metrics is something that most organizations suck at. Just purely suck at. And so we need to, as an entire, whatever the community or if your role in any way, shape, or form, excuse me, is in information security, build your metrics, right? And make sure that you're doing your job and making the people who are having the business financial decisions, making sure that they know the right things through the metrics, because they're not going to understand what the vulnerabilities are and your Nessus report that's like 800 pages long, right? Okay, so this is just the basic enterprise security architecture map or model that Gunnar really kind of put together in that 07 document, right? 07. Again, this isn't new stuff, right? We need to really kind of begin refocusing our efforts on enterprise security architecture. And as part of enterprise security architecture, we have vulnerability management. There's my intro. What was that, 10 minutes? Okay. So, vulnerability management. It's very, very simple. And most vulnerability management programs are broken down into two primary areas, right? One is intelligence, and the other is the actual act of scanning your systems to see if there are things that, are known to maybe have exploits, etc., right? That's the basic kind of like framework of vulnerability management. So there are obviously a lot of challenges with vulnerability management, right? The first one is very, very simple, right? Moore's Law. Well, guess what? As technology, increases, I'm just making an assumption that everybody knows what Moore's Law is. Does everybody know what Moore's Law is? Okay. So, guess what? Malware evolves at the same pace. So, awesome. But, the actual fact of vulnerability management itself is that it is a reactionary. It is a reaction to something that has to be discovered, right? Just like antivirus, okay? Antivirus is, however weeks, months, behind the actual malware that's out there because somebody has to discover it and then somebody has to disassemble it and figure out what it does. And there might be like crazy encryption going on. And then once they figure all that stuff out, they now have to write the code to, remove it or quarantine it or whatever from that system. It's a reactionary process, right? So vulnerability management in and of itself is a reactionary process. Embrace it. It is what it is. And we can work with this, okay? So yeah, intelligence, is having having the knowledge of the latest information that's out there. There's a number of things like, vulnerability management or vulnerability, newsletters and subscriptions that you can buy. I know Secunia is one big one, and Cisco has one, Symantec has one. You can basically subscribe to these things. And from an intelligence perspective, if something all of a sudden like is discovered that affects your assets, right? If you're running a Windows shop, oh, okay, now there's a new Windows one. They'll email you and say, hey, there's this thing, and we think it's pretty serious, and it can be exploited remotely, and it has elevated privileges, and blah, blah, blah. And so that's intelligence, okay? Now you know about that. Now we can do something about that. When we talk about metrics a little bit later on, we'll talk about time to remediation, right? Fantastic metric. But again, remember, everybody pretty much sucks at metrics. Communication, right? It's really, really important to have this type of have some semblance of communication, within the organization, especially if your enterprise is a really large enterprise, right? If there's a new vulnerability that affects the network team and you're the security team over here, if you can't successfully, basically knowledge transfer that information over to the network team, they're not going to do anything about it. And typically, if you do that successfully, they might not do anything about it anyway. But that's kind of their problem. Accountability then, and that leads to accountability, right? Accountability is, okay, there is something that affects your assets that you own, and you're responsible for the business ramifications if something has been, if something exploits that, right? Accountability is massive in all this. And then metrics, like I'm talking about. All right, so what are the goals here? Well, we want improved intelligence, right? We need, just like anything these days in security, you have to detect it quicker and react to it faster, okay? The speed and evolution of malware today is ridiculous, and your static controls are not good enough, right? There's detection and reaction that are really, in my mind, becoming way more important than the firewall itself. Not to say that that's not important, but, buy-in from all the service owners, the stakeholders, scanning, right? Oh, so did I completely do? Yeah. And so scanning activities. My bad. I did talk about that. So when we talk about the actual scanning, right, so intelligence on one side and scanning on the other side, we want to make sure that we're scanning all of the appropriate assets. And those assets really do need to kind of be prioritized from a business impact perspective. And again, enterprises, they probably have, like large enterprises, probably have some level of business impact where they say, something, out of the 100 or so business units within our organization, these 20 are the ones that are the most critical. And if something happens to one of these 20 business units, that's probably going to be bad. So let's prioritize that. Well, guess what? That has to then be communicated and understood down into the vulnerability management process. Because now we can take a look at those servers or web applications or whatever that support those critical business functions within the organization, and then react accordingly if something pops up that does affect those assets, and prioritize that maybe over something else that has a less of an impact of the organization. I'm talking really fast. I'm sorry. Integration with existing tools and the existing business ticketing systems. This is a bitch. There's no two ways about it. Because there are a number, obviously, there are a vast array of different types of business ticketing systems, like help desk ticketing and all that stuff. So getting the process to the point where we have, the discovery, the intelligence of some vulnerability that affects some level of server asset, etc., and then getting that into the appropriate queue, where then that team who owns that asset now they own they're accountable for solving or mitigating, that vulnerability. That tends to be very, very difficult. And in order to do this right, the service owners and stakeholders have to be in line with each other, and really up the chain, right? The CIO or whatever has to be like, guess what? This is your responsibility. Service owner or business unit owner or whatever, right? So once that communication that there is some type of vulnerability, once that's been communicated to the actual service or business unit owner, It's their responsibility to say, you know something? I don't feel like it. Or, yes, we will fix that. But that's where the accountability has to happen, right? Okay. So, in January, my friend over here and I were sitting and watching Bill Senf. Bill Senf, he did a presentation on the Application Security Verification Standard 2014. It's an OWASP kind of sub-project, okay? Right? Because if you here's an exercise. Everybody raise their hand. Yes. Raise your hand if you know what the OWASP top 10 is. Okay? Now, raise your hand if you think it's completely unimplementable. I do. It's ridiculously complex, right? But, it's a good starting point. So a bunch of people within OWASP said, you know something? It is pretty complex. Let's think about it a different way. And they came up with this application security verification standard. The 2014 version is what I'm going to base this talk off of, right? So what essentially I'm going to do is talk about the different levels within the ASVS 2014 standard and how that can apply to vulnerability management. Because when you kind of think about it, it's solving something very, very similar, right? Where on the application, the OWASP side of the house, we're talking about application development and making sure that there are certain things and certain ways of coding to ensure that we don't have vulnerabilities. Well, we're just going to take that same theory and just be like, okay, well, let's just apply this to vulnerability management, and now we have these things that really kind of make up different levels of vulnerability management. So level 0 of the ASVS 2014 is just okay, maybe there are some kind of things with something with internal that's around the actual development of code, etc. But it's not really it's not organized in any way, shape, or form that we really kind of care about. Level 1, okay, it's called opportunistic. Right, so applications in this sense, right, and again, I'm going to lay out the ASVS as it relates to application development, and then move into vulnerability management, right? So the applications can adequately defend itself against security vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities are easy to discover, and they're easy to discover. They can be discovered with low to minimal effort. Okay, it's a very, very kind of like low level from a framework perspective. Now, level 2, most organizations are probably going to fall into level 2 because level 3 is really, really hard. So if you do any type of application development and have some type of software development lifecycle, level 2 is probably adequate for most organizations where applications can defend itself from prevalent application security vulnerabilities of moderate to serious risk, including things that are in the OWASP top 10, and treats the application threats to the application will most likely come from opportunistic attackers. Okay, so level 3 then is advanced, and this is where the application can defend itself against advanced application security vulnerabilities. An inspection of application design is required. For the most part, level 3, trying to obtain level 3 in the ASVS is really probably going to be government and critical type of, why am I blanking on that term? Infrastructure, critical infrastructure, right? For the most part. So, we can totally improve this, right? So let's apply this now. I'm just going to let that run for a minute because I love it. All right, anyway. So let's apply this, right, to vulnerability management. Okay. So at a level 0, for the ASVS vulnerability, right? Again, there's no real structured framework, etc. Somebody might run an SScan here or there, but not on any type of any type of schedule, etc. So we don't really care. I don't really care about level 0. Level 1, all right. The organization can adequately defend itself against application security vulnerabilities that are easy to discover. Okay, that's pretty much, in line with, the ASVS for app dev. And vulnerabilities are typically discovered with minimal to low effort. Okay, that's kind of cool. It's very, very, very simple. As we move into, as we kind of then focus, what does that really mean, right? So I think that level 1 really, for organizations that want to try to get to some semblance of a standard within their vulnerability management program, let's talk about things like reliance on MS Patch Tuesday alerts. Okay, this is level 1, and for the most part, organizations like this probably don't have a dedicated InfoSec group, right? There's probably a process in place to patch, right? The Microsoft patches as they come out, right? So Patch Tuesday, and they take a look at that, and let's say that's within 45 days. Now, some of you may be looking at me like, are you insane, 45 days? But some of you may be like, yeah, that's about right. It's completely, that's a subjective thing based on your organization. But let's just say, for argument's sake, that 45 days is a reasonable amount of time to have Patch Tuesday Microsoft patches applied within your enterprise, okay? User workstation and user workstation non-Microsoft applications are being patched, but they're being patched basically because, let's say, Java says there's a new update, or Flash says there's a new update. There's no real process in place, right, that is watching, and there's no intelligence for if we talk about our intelligence and scanning, right? There's no real intelligence. The threat intelligence is probably coming from things like, InfoSec, InfoWorld, and the register and whatnot. And there might be some open source vulnerability scanning tool. Okay, I think that's decent. That's a decent kind of structure for a level 1 vulnerability management program. Is it good? No, I mean, we could absolutely, let's talk about level 2, right? So if we apply this level 2 to, the ASVS, then we're looking at an organization that can adequately defend itself against prevalent security vulnerabilities, right? And those security vulnerabilities are of moderate to serious risk. They include things like the SANS top 20 as well as the OWASP top 10, and the majority of the majority of business applications should work towards this level. Again, this is, I would say, for most organizations, level 2 is probably a good goal to set. Set your sights on level 2, unless you are in critical infrastructure or some type of very, very sensitive government work. Threats to the applications will most likely come from opportunistic hackers and possibly some motivated actors, right? So either that's competition, the business, espionage and whatnot, possibly even nation state, but maybe not, But that's probably that's I think a good framework. So what does that actually look like? All right. So level 2, I think, should really have for organizations that want to accomplish this. There should at this point be a dedicated InfoSec and risk group. Now, when I say that, I'm not talking about the firewall jockeys. All right. This is an organization within the business that is analyzing threats, right, vulnerabilities and threats to the business that then can, communicate that up to, the business leaders, etc. But these guys are the ones who are looking at all the intelligence. Speaking of intelligence, right, vulnerability intelligence feeds and subscriptions also should be in play here, right? You need to have an idea of without having to keep your, bury your head, in the computer looking and searching for, you need to have some type of, feed or subscription that says, guess what? You guys run HPUX, for, if anybody remembers HPUX. You run this particular thing and this version of this particular thing, and guess what? There's a new vulnerability that affects that particular thing specifically, right? So you have the ability to, to customize the alerts that you want to get, right? And that, excuse me. And those alerts then come in via email, and they can be, disseminated, etc., analyzed and disseminated as possible, or, as good as the organization can do. A formal monthly review of the previous 30 days worth of patches, right? So the patches that were last month, did we have any problems? Did some of them have to be, pulled back? Or did they get successfully deployed, right? Something formal that, every month, let's just say it's Patch Wednesday, right? The day after Patch Tuesday. Not only are we talking about, hey, there's a bunch of vulnerabilities that we have to push out now, but hey, how did last month go, right? So something formal from that perspective. Some type of centralized content management system for the actual intelligence data. A number of our clients, actually, when they get their feeds emailed to them, so here's a vulnerability intelligence feed, and, something that affects them, they get the email. That email actually automatically gets forwarded over to a SharePoint site, right? And that SharePoint site then takes that email and adds it to the list, right? So now we're building within the content management system, that intelligence is now centralized. And not only is it just centralized, but now we have the ability to say, hey, guess what? This is for the network team. Let's assign it. And those guys get alerted, right? It's pretty simple. It's not rocket science at all, right? The risk group may manually enter vulnerability events into the ticketing system, right? So at this point, level 2 isn't as sophisticated as everything is now completely automated, right? So the intelligence comes in, it's owned by this particular group, and then it automatically goes into the enterprise ticketing system or the help desk system. We're not quite there yet. We'll try to get there for level 3, but the group is probably manually entering that stuff in, as well as reviewing intelligence from an escalation perspective, right? If there, for example, is, the hacking team breach of a couple of weeks ago, right? Now we've got a bunch of 0 days, from Flash or whatever. And they're in the wild. Oh, and they're remotely executable. Oh, and, they infect your system not with user privileges, but with system privileges. Those variables, for most organizations, if they all live together in one vulnerability like that as a 0 day or whatever, that probably needs to be escalated. Right, because it's in the wild, and so it's that kind of analyzing the actual intelligence to determine whether or not there should be an escalation. Level 2 also probably has some level of commercial or open source scanning tools, right? So again, on the one side we have intelligence, but now we also have to talk about the scanning part of our organization, and from standard, there is at this point a standard for business asset scanning, right? So whether or not that standard includes off hours, we're only going to scan off hours, we're only going to scan with unauthenticated credentials, we're going to scan with authenticated credentials. That standard exists, right? So from a level 2 perspective, achieving this level 2, those standards have to exist. And for the most part, the scanning portion of the framework is really focused on probably only your Windows and maybe Unix and supporting network gear, right? It may not be quite mature enough where we're actually going after, printers and things of that nature. But, for argument's sake, let's just say it's primarily Windows and Unix and network assets. So, So that's kind of what I feel level 2, applying the application security verification standard to vulnerability management. I think that's what a level 2 kind of looks like. And organizations, I feel, can take something like this and now begin kind of building a roadmap to say, something, level 1's probably good enough for us, or level 2's good enough for us. Or if you're supporting really, really critical infrastructure, now let's talk about level 3, right? Because level 3 is wicked hard. In either of them, right? So, indicating that the organization can adequately defend itself against all advanced application security vulnerabilities and shows principles of good security design. So, the requirements here really have to include in-house application design, software development lifecycle, all the really fun parts of an enterprise security architecture. It's appropriate for critical applications that protect life, right, critical infrastructure, and or defense functions. Replaceable versus irreplaceable data. Josh Corman talks about this a lot. And essentially, if the way he kind of puts it is your credit card. What happens if your credit card gets stolen? Anyone? Anybody had a credit card stolen? Raise your hand. A couple? Few? Right? What happened? You get a new one. Right? You're not really liable for any of that stuff. That's replaceable data. Okay? Now, sure, we have to have PCI and whatnot to protect that because we don't really want those things to be stolen and then fraud and whatnot. But at the end of the day, it's kind of replaceable data. If you take a look at intellectual property, or even life, right? That's on the other side of the spectrum. Irreplaceable data, right? Electric cars are, Mark said this earlier, in his keynote, electric cars are computers with wheels these days, right? And so that's totally hackable, etc. So, from a replaceable to irreplaceable data spectrum, right, intellectual property, if your organization is, in some chemical field or whatever, and the formula for your flagship, application gets stolen, right? Well, that's gonna present a lot of problems from the business perspective, right? Potential, stock ramifications, competition ramifications. Somebody now can probably, produce your flagship product for cheaper, etc. That's more irreplaceable. So when we talk about applying this to the level 3 ASVS vulnerability, that's really probably in the area that those organizations that are kind of in this irreplaceable data, either life or critical, infrastructure, etc. This is where we're really talking about it. So what comprises level 3 at this point? And again, it's hard. This one is really hard. So vulnerability intelligence feeds are tied to inventories, enterprise inventory systems. In other words, if you are like a Microsoft shop and you have you're running SCCM for, your patching and all that stuff, outputting what you actually have from an enterprise inventory perspective into the vulnerability intelligence feeds so you get exactly what you want to know, the vulnerability alerts from your infrastructure that you absolutely know you have because it's coming from your own inventory systems, absolutely a must, right? InfoSec risk teams are analyzing and flagging these intelligence alerts in the content management system, right? So those alerts are now coming in based on your inventory and automatically going into whatever content management system. The InfoSec team, again, not the firewall guys, the InfoSec risk guys, are analyzing this data that is now in this centralized content management system and determining whether or not it's something that should be now assigned to one of those business units, right? Excuse me. Whether it's a network, whether it's a network vulnerability, whether it's a Windows or a Linux vulnerability, and assigning that to the appropriate teams. Support teams work tickets as part of their normal workflows. This is really, really hard also, right? Getting the cooperation of all of these different business units within your organization to actually say, something? This vulnerability, it's not something that's different in their day-to-day schedule, right? It's just part of a normal workflow. It's not new ticket, oops, we have something weird going on. This is part of their day-to-day life, okay? Something comes in, that's just part of their workflow, right? Sample sets of workstation vulnerability scans. Now, I say sample set because for the most part, at an enterprise level, most enterprises have at least some semblance of the golden image of, Windows 8, etc. And from a workstation perspective, we can probably monthly just, generate a random subset of workstation IP addresses and scan those. And we're probably not going to have a lot of, different differentiation between, what's found on one workstation over here and one workstation over here. They're probably going to be pretty similar, right? We're still obviously focusing on where the primary business critical data lives, right? Which theoretically should be servers and databases and all that. But, of course, I say that and everybody has one of these, right? Phones, printers, UPSs, NAS devices. Now we're looking at all these things as well. Anybody do penetration testing? Okay, so have you ever had the opportunity to look at a printer and see that inside the printer, because it has to be part of the domain, that they're storing not domain admin, but they're storing high-level privileges in clear text, login and password, Printers. Go after printers. They're hilarious. Right. But yeah, so we're looking at all this stuff now. It's not just our servers. It's not just our network. It's not just, the usual suspects. All scan reports now we're moving over to the scans themselves. The scans themselves, the reports are also auto-posted to our centralized content management system, right? So it's not just the intelligence feeds that are coming in and automatically getting into this for analysis. Now we're doing whatever our schedule is from breaking our enterprise down into, manageable sections to actually scan. Now those reports are going into, the content management system as well. And now we can assign, now we can assign those out to the appropriate groups as well. The InfoSec risk team has to review these things. And this is where, none of this can ever be 100% automated, right? You really do still need the risk team to be, looking at things and determining whether or not this should be, moved over to business unit A, B, or C, et cetera, whoever actually owns, and is accountable for those assets that the vulnerabilities are found on. The last few here is, right, so flagged scan reports trigger ticket auto creation. This is such a huge challenge, right? You're laughing. It's a huge challenge, right? So after the analysis is actually performed by the business, by the actual business risk team and the InfoSec team as to whether or not something needs to be assigned, as soon as that's assigned out, boom, from the content management system, that automatically, some API and some whatever internal custom code, that's going to your enterprise ticketing system and opening up a ticket and assigning that to the appropriate teams. Guess what we have there? Accountability. That's key. Support teams work on tickets as part of their normal workflows. I already talked about that. But at the bottom lines, in stakeholder and service owner reporting, now we have reports for all of these different people. Stay away from the giant, vulnerability scan reports for a lot of the business owners. You really just kind of want reports that say, you have 20 vulnerabilities, and if you fix them, you're going to mitigate 94% of, the things that could really harm your organization. It's the high level's fine, right? The details go to the actual teams through that, the enterprise ticketing system. But what's the most important thing here? I said it earlier. Anyone? Metrics. Metrics. Everybody sucks at metrics, right? So, again, when we talk in terms of our responsibility in InfoSec is to ensure that the business owners can make the appropriate financial investments without having to be the technical experts. We do this through metrics, right? There's all sorts of different cool metrics. Asset inventory, that's pretty basic, right? Scan periods, how often are they scanned? What are they, right? The internal assets, DMZ servers, etc. What's the scope of the scan? Discovery, authenticated, unauthenticated, the number of types and the hosts actually scanned, the number of vulnerabilities discovered, etc. Here's a cool one, right? Vulnerabilities by status. Now we have all this stuff in our enterprise ticketing system. Why was that vulnerability reopened? What happened, right? Why is it status, it was closed, but now it's been reopened? Did something break, right? We now have the ability to actually have metrics on all this stuff. And time to remediation. This one kills in boardrooms. It's fantastic, right? So a vulnerability was announced and your intelligence feeds, it got to you on, let's say, Monday the 1st. You didn't patch it until, Thursday the 22nd, right? So that's 22 days, time to remediation. Can we improve that? Why is it so long? Or actually, for some organizations, wow, that was really fast, right? Just kind of depends. But that's a great one. Time to remediation is a great metric. Here's some examples, right? Some of the things that we kind of use, if you're familiar with the Internet Storm Center, they do great analysis, right? So Patch Tuesday happens, and they'll say, something, Microsoft really only said that guy was important, but we think it's really critical. Every once in a while, they'll have something that says, patch now. Have you ever seen that? So, here's just an example, right, of some of the intelligence feeds that are available. This one happens to be from Cisco, but there's a bunch of them. Secunia has a really great one. Symantec is really good-ish, but they've got a lot of weird bells and whistles, etc. But, very, very, very simple information from a vulnerability management perspective and what you would probably expect, right? There's your CVSS stuff. Here's impact. This is what we like to really kind of take a look at when we're thinking about escalation, right? So in my mind, if the impact is, hey, it's an unauthenticated attack, and it's remote, right? And it actually it doesn't affect the system at the user level. It affects elevated privileges like system level or whatever. And it's in the wild. Guess what? We're escalating that shit immediately. But your mileage may vary, and it doesn't have to be all of those things, right? But that's it's very, very simple example of some of the feeds. This is a very simple example of I'm sure everybody knows what a vulnerability scan is, blah, blah, blah. But this is an example of one of our content management systems. So this guy, when it comes into us via email, it automatically gets populated here. And when I click that, actually that is the actual same one, right? The Flash player vulnerability. Yeah, that's that guy right there. So in my content management system, now I can click on that right there and read it, and now I can say, oh, you know something? That's probably something that the network people should be assigned to. So that then, once that's analyzed by the team and assigned to the appropriate business unit, now that goes out and and more than likely, depending on what level you're at, 1, 2, or 3, if you're 3, that's going to automatically go out to your enterprise ticketing system, create a ticket, and assign it to the network team because we want accountability. Just a couple more examples here. I'll just go through that. This is really simple stuff, right? So here's an example of splitting up your organization in your vulnerability scanner, by in this case it's by geolocation, right? And then very typical scanning examples. All right. So what does all this really give us? I think that from and I'm sorry, this last one. This is actually an example of that's the ticket that actually got opened in the enterprise ticketing system. Automatically, once the analysis team took a look at it and said, guess what? Those guys need to own that. Boom, there it is. Now, if anybody is familiar with enterprise help desk and ticketing systems, somebody is going to be looking at this on a periodic basis, saying, why isn't this closed? Right? So now we have a really good semblance of accountability. Okay, so that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about. So, what do we get out of this, right? So security focused, aligned to the enterprise security architecture. Again, vulnerability management is a process within the overarching enterprise security architecture. Focusing on the enterprise security architecture, again, the nerds will always say, and I think Mark said it earlier, or something similar to it, right? If you're compliant, you're probably not scared, but if you focus on the enterprise security architecture, you're also going to be compliant, right? So vulnerability management being a process of an enterprise security architecture. We have an implementable framework based on business need, right? So applying the application security verification standard, the OWASP thing to AppSec, applying that to vulnerability management, now we have a great framework that we can build upon and really kind of determine whether or not our organization should target level 1, level 2, or level 3 from a vulnerability management perspective. The content management and ticketing integration and ownership and accountability, and of course, my favorite, which we all know we all suck at, metrics. So, having said all that, here's a couple of references, right? This is that's Gunner's architect paper on his 06 or 07 enterprise security architecture blueprint. There is the actual OWASP ASVS version 2. Version 2 is what you want to take a look at. The version 1 is completely not, it wasn't mature. And then that's me. So having said that, I'm happy to take any questions, comments, arguments, etc. Feel free. Throw it at me. Yes, sir.
With the acquired companies, this is you send an InfoSec guy out there and look at their security, and you find that they've got a home router as their security, blah, blah, blah. And the lawyers and so forth, when you go in there and say, well, okay, we've fun essentially just replace this and start over and all that, they kind of push back. Do you see that more and more common, that we're just having to essentially re-architect security when you acquire an organization and just couldn't even try to suck it in and just deal with it up front rather than try to piecemeal later? More
and more I am. And the question is, do you see organizations kind of more and more going from an M&A perspective, a mergers and acquisitions perspective, just going in and saying, that sucks, let's just re-architect everything. So a lot of the organizations that I'm working with right now from an M&A perspective, one of the first things that they do is they let the InfoSec team hit the ground first because it's called threat inheritance. What are we inheriting, right? So the InfoSec team that, is responsible for the analysis that I was talking about, right? So the intelligence comes into the content management system. Those guys are doing the analysis. They're also, in some way, shape, or form responsible for the scanning of the internal assets. Those guys are hitting the ground, dropping a probe that then, is either remotely controllable, and that's the scanning engine on site, getting an idea of threat inheritance, right? And that's really, really important from an M&A perspective. And that will give them then the obvious, not the obvious, maybe not, but that will give them the ability to say, something? Yeah, maybe we should re-architect all this. Or, that's acceptable. Let's, or we don't have to prioritize it immediately, right? Yeah. Anybody else? Lay it on me. Come on. Wait for it. Nope. Okay. Thanks, guys.